it's Angela with Broadhead Memorial Public Library, back with another episode of Have You Heard? We continue to read Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIHM by Robert C. O'Brien with pictures by Zenna Bernstein. A quick thank you to Athenaeum Books for Young Readers for allowing us to share this story with you this summer. If you are enjoying these videos, be sure to like the video below, and you can also subscribe to our page and you'll get alerts for when we post new Have You Heard videos and other videos that the library puts together. All right, yesterday we learned all about Thorn Valley, which is the rats' new plan. So they have been working for a while to not depend on stealing from Farmer Fitzgibbon in order to live. So let's find out what happens next. All right, the next chapter is called Captured. Speaking of schedules and countdowns, Mr. Ages spoke suddenly. We've got one for this evening. It's getting late. The clock on Nicodemus's desk said 5 o'clock. Mrs. Fitzgibbon feeds Dragon at 6 p.m. He spoke gently, but his voice had a chilling sound to Mrs. Frisby. They all looked at her. I'm ready, she said quietly, but there are still a few minutes, and one question you have not yet answered. Why did Jonathan never tell me anything about NIHM, or any of the rest? Mr. Ages said, I'll try to explain. When Nicodemus and the others moved into the cave near the rose bush, they invited Jonathan and me to stay with them. After all, we had been with them for many months by that time, and at first we did, but after a few weeks, we decided to move out. We were, you realize, different. We both felt strange, associating always and only with rats, even though they were our close and good friends. As for me, I wanted more solitude and less society. Jonathan, on the other hand, was younger than I and felt lonely. So we moved, at first together, to the basement of the old farmhouse where I still live. Then Jonathan met you, at a stream near the woods somewhere, I think. Yes, Mrs. Frisby said, I remember. From then on he worried. He didn't want to be secretive, but he didn't know how to tell you one thing. I'm sure Nicodemus has explained to you that the injections we got at NIHM had two effects. One of them was that none of us seemed to be growing any older at all. The children, yes, but not the adults. Apparently the injections had given us all a much longer lifespan than even Dr. Schultz had anticipated. You can see why this would have been a dreadful thing for Jonathan to tell you. You never had the injections. That meant while he stayed young, you would grow older and older and finally die. He loved you, and he could hardly stand that thought. Yet if it was distressing to him, he thought, how much more painful would it be to you? That is what he could not bring himself to tell you. He would have told you eventually. I know he intended to. Indeed, you would have found out on your own. You would have seen it happening. But it was hard. He kept putting it off. And then, finally, it was too late. Poor Jonathan, said Mrs. Frisby. He should have told me. I wouldn't have minded. But will my children also have longer lives? Said Nicodemus. We don't know yet. We think so, but our own children are not yet old enough to be certain. We do know that they have inherited the ability to learn. They master reading almost without effort. He stood up, took off his reading glasses, and looked at the clock. But Mrs. Frisby interrupted again. One more thing, she said. What happened to Jenner? Nicodemus said, He left. He was against the plan from the start. In our discussions, he tried to persuade others to oppose it too. Only a few joined him, though. There are some others who are still doubtful about it. They're going to stay with us and try it. The arguments stayed reasonably friendly, but the last straw for Jenner was that when we decided to destroy the machines. Destroy them? For two reasons. One, so that if anyone ever finds the cave, there won't be any evidence of what we've been doing. Nothing but broken bits of metal, debris that will look like ordinary junk. We'll pull out our electric cable, our lights and our water pipes. We'll close up all the tunnels leading to it. The other reason is more important. When we move to Thorn Valley, we're going to have some hard times. We know that, and we're braced for it. If this cave is still open, with the machines and lights, the carpets, and the running water still here, there will be a terrible temptation to give up and move back to the soft life. We want to remove that temptation. But when Jenner heard the decision, it was made at a meeting, he grew really angry. He denounced us all as idiots and dreamers. He stamped out of the meeting, and a few days later, he left the group forever, taking 6 of his followers with him. We don't know where they went, but we think they will try to find someplace where they can set up a new life like this one. I wish them luck, but they'll have trouble. There won't be any toy tinker this time. They'll have to steal their machines, everything. That worries us some, because if they get caught, who knows what might happen. But there's nothing we can do about it. We're going ahead with the plan, and once we get to Thorn Valley, I think we can stop worrying. Justin stood up. It's time to go. He picked up the paper with the sleeping draft in it. Mrs. Frisby, Justin, and Mr. Ages walked together up the long corridor of the rose bush. Remember, when you come up through the hole in the kitchen floor, Mr. Ages said, you'll be under the cabinets. It's low, but there's room to move. Go a few steps forward, and you'll be able to see out into the room. Mrs. Fitzgibbon will be there, getting dinner for her family. They eat at about 6. When she's got their dinner ready, she'll feed Dragon. He won't be in the kitchen, but he'll be waiting just outside the kitchen door on the porch. She doesn't let him in while she's cooking because he makes such a pest of himself, rubbing against her ankles and getting between her feet. If you look to your right, you'll see his bowl. It's blue, and it has the word kitty written over and over again around the side. She'll pick it up, fill it with cat food, and put it down again in the same place. Then watch closely. She'll walk over to the door to let him in, and that's your chance. Her back will be toward you. She's got to walk about 20 feet. It's a big kitchen. The bowl will be about 2 feet away from you. Be sure the paper packet is open, then dash out. Dump the powder into the food and dash back. You don't want to be in sight when Dragon comes in. I can tell you that from experience. Is that how you got hurt? I got there a few seconds late. I decided there was still time. I was wrong. At the arch in the rosebush, Mr. Ages left them. With his cast, he would not be able to climb through the hole in the kitchen. There was no point in his going farther. Mrs. Frisby and Jonathan moved out of the rosebush and looked around them. It was still light, though the sun was low on the horizon. Straight ahead of them, perhaps 200 feet away, stood a big white farmhouse. Dragon was already on the porch, sitting just outside the door, looking at it expectantly. To their right was the tractor shed, and beyond that was the barnyard fence and the barn itself, casting a long shadow. Behind them rose the woods and the mountains. To the left, Mrs. Frisby could see the big stone in the middle of the garden, near which her children waited. As soon as her task was done, she thought, she must hurry to them and get ready for the move. We go under the right side of the house, Justin said quietly. Follow me. They made their way around the edge of the yard, staying in the shadows, keeping an eye on Dragon. Justin wore his satchel and had put the powder package in it. There was a basement under the main part of the Fitzgibbons' house, but the big kitchen had been added later and stood on a foundation of concrete blocks with only a crawl space beneath. As they approached this gray foundation, Mrs. Frisby saw that near the middle of it, a few inches off the ground, there was a square patch of darker gray. It was a hole, left for ventilation, and there was a screen over it. When they reached it, Justin caught hold of the screen and pulled the corner. It swung open. We loosened it a bit, he explained, holding it open for her. Mrs. Frisby crept through. Careful, he said. It's dark. There's a drop of about a foot. Just jump. We put some straw at the bottom, so it's soft. Holding her breath, Mrs. Frisby jumped blindly into the blackness and felt the cushion of straw underneath her feet. In a moment, Justin landed beside her. They were under the Fitzgibbons' kitchen. Now, he said softly, look to your left. See the patch of light? That's the hole. The light comes from the kitchen. We've piled dirt up under it so it's easy to reach. Come on." Mrs. Frisby followed him, and as they got near the bright hole, she could see around her a little. They were walking across bare earth, dry and cool to the touch. Overhead there were heavy wooden beams holding up the floor, and above those the floorboards themselves. Under the hole rose a small round hill of dirt. They walked up this, and then Justin whispered, "This is as far as I can go. There's not room for me to get through. I'll wait here. Come back down as soon as you're finished. Here's the powder." He handed her the paper packet. "Remember to tear it open before you go out to Dragon's Bowl. Hurry now. I can hear Mrs. Fitzgibbon's moving around. She's getting the dinner. Be careful, and good luck." Mrs. Frisby first pushed the packet up through the hole. Then, as quietly as she could, grasping both sides, she pulled herself up into the kitchen. It was light there, but Mr. Ages had not been joking when he said that the ceiling was low. There was less than an inch between the floor and the bottom of the cabinet, so that she could not walk properly, but had to flatten herself out and crawl. She did a few steps and discovered that she was trembling. "Stay calm," she told herself. "Don't get panicky, or you'll do something foolish and spoil everything." Thus admonished, she crept forward again until she was near the edge of the cabinet. She stopped. From there she could see out into the kitchen fairly well. Straight across from her stood a big white gas stove, and in front of it, putting the lid on the pot, was Mrs. Fitzgibbon. Because the edge of the cabinet was so low, Mrs. Frisby could not see her head, but only her shoulders. "There," said Mrs. Fitzgibbon, as if to herself. "The stew is done, the bread's in the oven, the table is set." Where was the cat bowl? Mrs. Frisby looked to her right, as Mr. Ages had said. There it was, blue with words inscribed around the side. Yet something was wrong. It was not 2 feet from the cabinet, but more like 4 or 5. In the corner, where it should have been, rose 4 round wooden legs. She realized that she was looking at the bottom of a kitchen stool. No matter, she thought, the extra distance is just a couple of feet. Mr. Ages had not mentioned a stool, but perhaps they moved it around. She crawled to the right, as close to the bowl as she could get without showing herself, and tore open the package. Just as she did this, Mrs. Fitzgibbon walked over from her stove. Her hand appeared, picked up the bowl, and Mrs. Frisby heard a thump on the counter over her head. A cutting sound, a can opener, the scrape of a spoon, and the bowl was back on the floor. The strong fishy smell of cat food. Mrs. Fitzgibbon walked away. "Now!" There's a picture. Let me show it to you. All right. "Now!" Mrs. Frisby moved swiftly out into the room, across the open floor, holding the powder, her eyes intent only on the bowl. She was no longer trembling. She poured in the powder, which instantly dissolved in the moist cat food. Still clutching the paper, she turned and sped toward the cabinet. With a bang, the lights went dim. The ceiling, which had somehow become curved, was filling with little round moons. Mrs. Frisby kept running, and her face struck a cold, hard wall of metal. A voice shouted, "Mother, don't let Dragon in yet! I've caught a mouse!" Billy, the younger Miss Fitzgibbon's son, had been sitting on the kitchen stool, his feet up on a rung, eating berries from a colander. The colander upside down was now over Mrs. Frisby. All right, let's see if we can get one more chapter in here. I think we can. It's kind of short. It's called 7 Dead Rats. From a bird cage, Mrs. Frisby watched the Fitzgibbons eat dinner. There was dinner for her, too. Bread crumbs, cheese, and bits of carrots on the floor of the cage, along with a small bowl of water. The cage had been occupied until a few months before by a yellow canary named Porgy, who had lived in it for 5 years and then died of old age. To get her out from under the colander, Billy had slid a piece of cardboard beneath it, pinching her foot sharply in the process so that it hurt when she walked. She had been transferred first to a shoebox. "Can I keep it?" Billy asked his mother. "For what? It's just a field mouse." "For a pet. I like it." Billy had tried to look at Mrs. Frisby through some holes he had punched in the top of the box, but it was dark inside. I suppose so, for a few days. You'll have to feed it. I think I'll put it in Porgy's cage. I can't see it in this box. It must be hungry. It was trying to eat Dragon's food. Silly mouse. It might have been killed. No one had noticed the small torn piece of paper at first. Then Mrs. Fitzgibbon had absently picked it up and tossed it into the wastebasket. A few days? Mrs. Frisby felt sick. And after a few days, then what? Would they let her go? Or would Billy plead for a few more? But even if they did set her free, her children were alone. The rats were coming tonight to move her house. Why had Billy picked today, of all days, to sit on the stool? She had not the heart to eat the food that lay on the cage floor. She felt like weeping. Paul came in for dinner, followed by his father. He looked at her in the cage. "Why don't you let it go?" he said to Billy. "Poor little thing, it's scared to death." "No, it's not. It's just not used to the cage. I bet it'll die." "I bet it won't. You can't just put wild animals in cages. You have to catch them when they're babies." "They do it in the zoo." Yes, but they know more about it. Anyway, a lot of those die too." "It's strange that it was here at all," said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. "I haven't seen any signs of mice. I didn't think we had any." They sat at the table and Mrs. Fitzgibbon served the stew. It was a long, square-cut farm table, big enough to feed, besides the family, 4 hired hands who would be working with Mr. Fitzgibbon during the planting and the harvesting. The Fitzgibbons sat together around one edge of it. Mrs. Frisby's cage hung from a metal stand in the corner on the opposite side of the room, quite high up so that the floor where she crouched was above their heads. She could watch them, looking down, but if she retreated to the far side of the cage, they could not see her, nor she them. She kept hoping that Paul would resume the argument with Billy and win it, or at least convince Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgibbon that they should let her go. But Paul was now busy eating. So, moving quietly, she crept to the back of the cage. There was a sliding door halfway up the side, which Billy had lifted to put her in. Remembering Nicodemus's story, she looked at it, wondering if she could climb to it, if she could get it open, if she could get it open if she did. Not now, but later, when they had left the kitchen. Maybe, but it looked quite big and heavy. She thought about her children again. Surely, when Justin had waited a little longer, he would realize that something had gone wrong. He would go and talk to them. But what could he tell them? "Children, your mother went into the kitchen with Dragon, and she hasn't come out?" No. But whatever he said, they would be dreadfully frightened and worried. Poor Cynthia, poor Timothy, poor all of them. She had one small satisfaction. Dragon, who had been admitted after she was safely caged, had eaten his bowl of cat food greedily, sleeping powder and all, purring as he licked the last scraps from the bottom. Billy was looking at the cage. "There," he cried. "It walked. I saw it. I told you it was all right." He started up from his chair. "Billy, stay in your place and eat your stew," said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. "The mouse can wait." "Speaking of mice," said Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had driven to town that afternoon, "there was quite a stir today at Henderson's hardware store." "About mice?" "No, but nearly. About rats. I went in to order the new linchpin, and there was quite a group in there talking about an odd thing that had happened. It seems that 6 or 7 rats got themselves electrocuted there a few days ago. Very strange. Henderson sells motors. He has a whole shelf of them. The rats, for some reason, had got on the shelf. He says it looked as if they were fooling with one of the motors, trying to move it." "That's a new one," said Paul. "Rats stealing motors?" "They weren't really, of course. Anyway, it happened during the night. When Henderson, came into the shop the next morning, he tried to turn on the lights, and the fuse was blown. He found the rats all grouped around the motor. It had been left plugged in, though it was turned off. They must have been gnawing at the insulation for some reason. At least, that's what he thinks. They caused a short circuit, and all bunched together like that, the current went through them and killed the lot." "Pretty good kind of rat trap, I'd say," Mrs. Fitzgibbon remarked. Mrs. Frisby was now listening to the conversation very closely. Dragon had stretched out on the floor, looking drowsy. "Wait," said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "That's only the beginning. It seems that the local weekly was hard up for news. They heard about it and they sent their reporter over." "Fred Smith?" said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. "Yes. Fred wrote a little article about it with the headline, 'Mechanized Rats Invade Hardware Store,' something like that. Well, it attracted more attention than he expected. The next thing they knew, believe it or not, the federal government got into it. They sent a squad over there from the Public Health Service with a truckload of equipment." "Just on the account of 7 rats?" said Billy. "They should send a truck over here. We've got more than that." "That's just what I said," Mr. Fitzgibbon went on. "And you know, they're going to. I was joking, of course, but the man in charge of the group didn't take it as a joke at all. He wanted to know where the farm was, how far away, how many acres, what I raised, how many rats that I thought there were. He acted really interesting. It seems they wanted to examine the dead rats at Henderson's, but they couldn't. He'd already sent them to the town dump, and they were incinerated." "I never heard of such a thing," said Mrs. Fitzgibbon. "All that fuss over a few dead rats?" "I have," said Paul, "and I bet I know what they're after." "What?" "They think the rats have rabies. They don't like to say so because it makes people so panicky." "What's rabies?" asked Billy. "A disease," said Mr. Fitzgibbon, "a very bad one, spread by animals. You know, Paul, I think you're probably right. That would explain why the Public Health Service is in it. Epidemic control. Anyway, they're planning to check on the rats all over this area." "Don't you remember," Paul said, "a few years ago when everybody had to lock up their dogs and some people were shooting every dog they saw? That's why they kept it quiet until they're sure. And another thing, they taught us in the vet course in school that when animals start acting strangely, it may be signs of rabies. Well, chewing electric wires, that's strange enough." "And they think some rats here might be infected?" Mrs. Fitzgibbon sounded worried. "I suppose they must," said Mr. Fitzgibbon, "though they never mentioned rabies at all." "When are they coming?" "Day after tomorrow, Saturday morning. The man in charge, a doctor somebody, said they'll have some more checking to do in town tomorrow. They're coming with an extermination truck. Cyanide gas, I think." "I can tell you where to look," said Paul. "Me too," said Billy, "under the rose bush." "That's right," said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "In fact, they'll probably want to bulldoze that bush out of there. I can do that with the big tractor." "Bulldoze my rose bush?" said Mrs. Fitzgibbon indignantly. "They will not." "Look at it this way," her husband said. "I've got to get rid of all those rats anyways. I've already decided to. They're stealing too much feed. Seeds, too. More and more all the time. If I pay an exterminator to do it, he'll charge a couple $100. If the government will do it for free, shouldn't we let him?" "Well," said Mrs. Fitzgibbon, still not soothed, "then you can spend the money to buy me some new rose bushes." "That's just what I had in mind," said Mr. Fitzgibbon with a smile, "and maybe some lilacs, too." Mrs. Fitzgibbon always wanted a lilac bush. They were her favorite shrubs. Mrs. Frisby did not believe it at all. Mrs. Frisby did not believe at all that it was rabies the men were looking for. She wished Mr. Fitzgibbon had been able to remember the name of Dr. Somebody, and now she had another urgent reason to get out of the cage. Somehow she had to warn Nicodemus. Dragon slept on the kitchen floor. All right, well, we are going to stop there for today. We'll be back tomorrow with more of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIM. I think we probably have 2 days left of this book. So if you are participating in our summer reading program, go ahead and write down 25 minutes of reading time for today, and we'll be back tomorrow with more chapters of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIM. All right, have a great day, everyone. Bye.